A little over 10 years since the release of Grand Theft Auto 5, the Grand Theft Auto 6 trailer debuted on December 4th, 2023. It was announced on Instagram that the trailer would be launching on December 5th, but it was leaked the day before, and therefore Rockstar, the company that makes the franchise, released it earlier than expected. This was an unsurprising turn of events, considering about a year ago the company, quote, suffered a network intrusion in which an unauthorized third party illegally accessed and downloaded confidential information from their systems, including early development footage of Grand Theft Auto 6, end quote. Nonetheless, the trailer went on to break records, becoming the most viewed trailer launch of all time within a 24-hour period, bringing in nearly 100 million views. Now, as of today, at what the latest installment of the franchise might look like. The question is, why? And assuming you heard the title of my paper, what could a new Grand Theft Auto game possibly have to do with early modern England? The brief answer: the stigma against playing video games that exists in contemporary North America is similar to the stigma against reading and writing poetry in early modern England. And I think when Sir Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poesy is considered, video games might be a form of poetry. Now here's the long answer. 429 years ago, in 1595, Sir Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poesy was published. For those that are unfamiliar with it, The Defense was one of the first treatises to defend the value of poetry. It likely stands as a response to Stephen Gosson, a satirist who, quote, attacked poets and actors from a rigidly pious perspective that called into question the morality of any fiction making, end quote. People have always cared about entertainment and will always care about entertainment, but in one way or another, enjoying oneself seems to have always carried a stigmatic weight. It should be noted also that Sidney's defense is not a defense, according to Alan Sinfield, quote, of poetry as against prose, but of fiction as against fact. The word poetry often covered all imaginative writing, whether in prose or verse, in the early modern. Poesy creates an experience superior in terms of entertainment than to that of drier forms of writing. The defense, which begins with Sidney telling us about how when he and, quote, the right virtuous Edward Wotton were at the emperor's court together, they gave themselves to learn horsemanship of John Pietro Pugliano, end quote. By beginning his theory with an account of the lessons of horsemanship, he hooks his reader with narrative, with story, with poetry, and uses Pugliano's claim of what makes a good horseman as inspiration to say what makes good writing. Even though The Defense of Poesy is a theoretical poetic treatise, he uses poetic language and strategies throughout the piece to prove his point on a formal level as he makes it on a literal one. Sidney seems to like playfulness, both with his horse riding obsession and his interest in what makes language fun. I hope at this point, judging by how much Sidney likes to play with words and horses, you might think that if he was transported into 2024 and placed in front of a television to play a video game, there's a small possibility he would enjoy it. Maybe, too, there's the smallest pinch of a possibility he would have driven a car around in Grand Theft Auto to emulate how much he liked to travel by horseback. However, if we are to take Sidney at his word in the defense, then it is clear he would have hated Grand Theft Auto. For Sidney thinks there are three kinds of poetry, all either in service to God or society, the third being the type of poetry that he devoted most of his time to, that which, quote, most properly do imitate, to teach and delight, and to imitate, borrow nothing of what is, hath been, or shall be, but only reigned with learned discretion, into the divine consideration of what may be and should be. Ultimately, Sidney, at least in the defense, believes that poetry's aim is to teach and delight, and I have some nice images there. They are also blocking some of my text. That's not how it was when I heard it, but sorry about that. Yeah, so to move one, poetry's goal for Sidney is to move one toward virtue, and that he thinks learning is purification of wit. Considering Grand Theft Auto encourages the player to digitally steal and kill, perhaps it is not poetry and does indeed deserve the stigmatization that it has endured for not pushing one toward virtue. Grand Theft Auto 4 did, after all, move teenagers to commit crimes. In 2008, the Associated Press put out a report on television about teenagers copying Grand Theft Auto in a crime spree. The report begins with the line, "Grand Theft Auto isn't just a game anymore," where the report goes on to talk about 6 teenagers who went on a violent crime spree, did a bunch of horrible stuff, copying a character in the video game. And when a civilian was interviewed in the video report, she said that she thinks GTA is a disgrace that should be taken off the market because it encourages children to commit crimes. I suppose by that definition, we should be taking quite a lot off shelves, including Sidney's own Astrophil and Stella. Astrophil and Stella, or ANS for short, depicts a man trying to sleep with a married woman for 108 sonnets, and even at one point kissing her unconsensually. In the second song of the poem, Astrophil hangs over Stella while she is disarmed and sleeping. Her tongue, waking, still refuseth, giving frankly in a guard, no. Now will I attempt to know what no her tongue sleeping useth. See the hand which waking guardeth, sleeping, grants a free resort. Now will I invade the fort. Cowards love with loss rewardeth. Her tongue refuses him, as Astrophil interprets it as saying no, an interpretation probably influenced by her rejection of him throughout the text and her occupation with her husband. Yet Astrophil sees her sleeping as granting him a free resort to invade the fort. Even though he begins to regret his action before committing the kiss, oh fool, think of the danger of her just and high disdain. He only fears the danger of her contempt, not how it might affect her. Certainly, kissing married women non-consensually and participating in infidelity is unvirtuous, so Sidney's Astrophil and Stella contradicts his defense of poesy, which said poetry should lead us to virtue. Maybe this is inconsequential. Maybe Sidney is entitled to writing whatever he likes and should not be held to any one thing he has written previously. Maybe he does not see himself as the type of poet that he argues for. Maybe he thought that Astrophil and Stella was an example of bad behavior, which would reversely inspire virtue, and that one is to look at Astrophil as a prime example of immorality, to which one should act oppositely. Adding up the facts, though, that ANS was published posthumously, that he published the Defense of Poesy after the death of Gosson, the most likely reason he does not stay true to his theory of poetics is, in my view, that Sidney felt pressured by social responsibilities and consequences while writing the defense. Alan Sinfield writes about the cultural apparatus of early modern England in Fault Lines. His 8th chapter illustrates the significance of Puritan humanism and virtue in Sidney's social groups. We learn in Fault Lines that, quote, Sidney belonged to a faction committed to defending and enhancing the foreign religion in England, and to doing this in part through cultural intervention. While I think the Defense of Poesy is an earnest attempt at defending the genre of imaginative writing, it is done so quite tactfully, always making sure to remind its reader that poetics are intertwined with promoting virtue. Theoretically, I might think the same, that art should make people better. Poetry should inspire one, should move one towards something positive, not to cheat, lie, steal, or kill, as ANS and GTA might promote. However, following the logic that portraying naughtiness in fiction inspires people to be bad is a bit archaic, like that of what Sidney dealt with. But if we are to take the aforementioned civilians' response to Grand Theft Auto as any indicator of the cultural temperature toward video games, this issue of virtuousness remains a contemporary one. The incident with the teenagers in the grand scheme of stigmatizing video game players was really fairly minor. For one other example, Grand Theft Auto 3 was blamed for inspiring William and Joshua Buckner for shooting a random motorist on a highway in 2003. By the previously quoted civilian's logic, though, we should be taking, say, The Catcher in the Rye off shelves because Mark David Chapman used it as the reason he killed John Lennon. There have been a huge number of instances where video games and fiction were blamed for violence and mischief, but the U.S. Supreme Court ruled to protect games under the First Amendment after decades of scientific study have failed to prove such a link. Assuming the Supreme Court is correct, if playing Grand Theft Auto or reading Astrophil and Stella is not going to make us into heathens, what are these pieces of media doing exactly? Why do people like them? The things you can do in GTA are objectively horrible, were they to be played out in reality. Why do people like running over other people in video games? Or reading about chasing married women? Are these incidents funny when played out in fiction? Are they terrifying? Maybe this combination of comedy and terror in literature is satire, which leads me finally to John Donne, another early modernist poet. His satire 1, for example, explores London's middle class, where a fondling motley humorist distracts the speaker and takes him out on the town. When the humorist meetest one with inquiring eyes, dost search, and like a needy broker prize, the silk and gold he wears, and to that rate, so high or low, dost raise thy formal hat. He is concerned with material. He likes gold and silk. The speaker notes that the humorist is improvidently proud and cannot wait to greet every fine silken painted fool we meet. He them to him with amorous smiles allures, and grins, smacks, shrugs, and such an itch endures as prentices or schoolboys. All in all, the humorist is a fool, an immature boy excited by superficiality, excited by everything that the speaker dislikes, the speaker who would rather stay at home with his books. In Donne's Satire 1 and The Closure of the Law, Gregory Needle goes as far to suggest that this fondling motley humorist is Donne's penis, which recontextualizes the poem to be even raunchier than it initially appears. Either way, the text is not just crude nonsense. It sheds light on aspects of society Donne cannot make sense of himself. Satire is his way of poking fun at the superstitious Puritan in England. Satire 1 is, in one reading, about masculinity and the nonsense of male desire. In another, it is about two opposite people seeing the world differently and making fun of the average Londoner. Satire makes light of topics usually unspeakable. Grand Theft Auto, in my eyes, carries Donne's torch. GTA video games are, maybe, poetic satires of American capitalism. The fifth installment in the series primarily takes place in Los Santos, a reinvention of Los Angeles, and follows three protagonists, Michael, Trevor, and Franklin. Michael is an ex-bank robber who makes a deal with the Federal Investigation Bureau, a play on the FBI, FIB, to fake his death and exit his life of crime. Trevor is one of his ex-acquaintances, a man that lives in the Grand Sonora Desert, a reinvention of the Sonoran Desert in California. Franklin, the youngest of the three, is an African-American man living in Strawberry, Los Santos, inspired by Crenshaw, Los Angeles. The three, by random dire financial circumstances, find themselves working together on a slew of heists in an attempt to gain permanent financial security. The game makes its players smile because America, is an insane place filled with racial, social, and financial inequalities. GTA 5 allows humorously exposes Los Angeles for its class divide. At first, it seems bizarre that one might have to rob a bank to live decently in LA, but upon reflection, GTA 5 pushes its player to ultimately realize that the reason GTA is funny is because it carries truth. It would be ridiculous to chase someone around who is married. If they both like each other, why not just be together? I know it's not that simple, but shouldn't it be? It would be ridiculous to go out and explore the town when one would rather stay home with their books. Should people not do what they please, especially when studying is good and decent in Dunn Satire 1? Should one not be able to live in the US, in Los Angeles, without having to commit crimes to eat? Satire is effective because it questions illogical everyday circumstances and is worthwhile because it begins serious conversations about culture, politics, and society. Grand Theft Auto video games mobilize the same playful, poetic satire that Sydney's Astrophil and Stella and Dunn's Satire 1 initially employed, continuing a long history of satirical narrative tradition. And without Sydney's defense, who knows where we would be.